Small words carry a lot of weight on this exam, and the fastest way to lose points is to treat those words as decoration.
The stem can describe a realistic situation where multiple answers are technically defensible, and then one key word quietly tells you which of those defensible answers is the one the examiner wants.
This is not trickery so much as a way to test judgment, because real security work involves choosing among competing priorities and imperfect options.
When you train yourself to treat keywords as selection filters, the question becomes less about guessing and more about applying a consistent decision rule. That consistency matters under pressure because it prevents you from chasing whichever option sounds most impressive. Over time, you stop reading questions as stories and start reading them as decision prompts with explicit constraints.
The word best is asking for the most appropriate choice across competing constraints, not the most technically sophisticated control you can imagine.
In practice, best usually implies you must balance risk reduction with realities like scope, feasibility, cost, and organizational authority.
Many answer choices will describe something that works, but best pushes you toward the option that fits the scenario's constraints while addressing the root problem. If one option solves the issue but requires unrealistic changes for the role or time window described, it is often not best in the exam sense.
The best answer typically provides broad, durable risk reduction without overreaching beyond what is implied.
Think of best as most appropriate given this context, not as strongest in isolation.
The word first shifts the question from selection to sequencing, meaning the examiner wants you to choose what must happen before later steps make sense.
This often involves prerequisites like identifying what you are protecting, confirming the scope of an incident, establishing authorization, or ensuring a control baseline exists before tightening it.
Many wrong answers to first questions are actions that are valid, but they belong later in the sequence.
The exam rewards an understanding of order of operations, especially where steps depend on one another logically.
If you pick a later step prematurely, you signal that you are acting without foundation.
When you see first, your job is to find the earliest necessary action that enables the rest of the response path.
Most likely is different because it asks for probability based on typical conditions and patterns rather than possibility.
Many options may describe things that could happen, but most likely pushes you toward what usually happens given the scenario cues. This is where experience and pattern recognition matter, because the exam expects you to reason from common failure modes and typical attacker behavior. Edge cases and rare technical anomalies are usually wrong unless the question strongly signals them.
Most likely also requires you to pay attention to what is normal for the environment described, because probability depends on context.
If you anchor your thinking in typical causes and typical outcomes, most likely questions become far less ambiguous. The keyword primary asks for the main driver or dominant purpose, not a secondary benefit that also happens to be true.
In security, many controls provide multiple benefits, so exam questions use primary to force you to identify the intended purpose of a control or decision.
For example, a control might improve both confidentiality and integrity, but its primary purpose in a given context may be one of those.
Candidates often miss primary by choosing an option that is a real advantage, but not the central reason the control exists.
When you see primary, ask what the control is fundamentally designed to accomplish, not what it can also help with. This keeps you aligned with intent rather than with incidental outcomes.
Most effective emphasizes impact, meaning which option most strongly reduces risk or achieves the desired security objective.
This differs from best because most effective tends to care less about convenience and more about measurable risk reduction. It still operates within context, but it pushes you toward the option that produces the greatest protective effect rather than the option that is easiest to implement. When multiple answers are feasible, most effective often favors stronger controls, broader coverage, or more reliable enforcement. However, it still expects realism, so an answer that is theoretically powerful but impractical in the scenario can still be wrong.
Treat most effective as highest impact within the boundaries implied by the question. The word initial often implies scoping, validation, or gathering facts before decisive action. Many exam stems describe a situation where you do not yet have enough evidence to jump to a permanent fix, and initial nudges you toward confirming what is happening and what the real boundaries are.
This can include confirming an incident, assessing impact, validating assumptions, or establishing a baseline before making changes that could disrupt operations.
The mistake many candidates make is treating initial as do the main thing now, when the exam expects a careful first move. Initial often prioritizes actions that reduce uncertainty or prevent escalation, while preserving options. When you see initial, look for the step that sets up correct decisions, rather than the step that completes the whole solution. Accept flips the selection logic, which sounds simple but reliably causes errors because your brain wants to select the correct thing rather than the outlier. With accept, you must identify the options that belong and then pick the one that does not. This requires you to hold the category in mind and verify each choice against it. The best technique is to convert the stem mentally into all of the following are true or appropriate, except, and then actively look for the mismatch. The mismatch is often subtle, such as a control that applies to a different phase, a term that belongs to a different role, or an option that contradicts the stated constraint. When except appears, slow down slightly, because speed increases error rates disproportionately here. Least pushes you toward minimal effect, minimal likelihood, or minimal risk reduction, depending on what the question is measuring. The trap is that many candidates treat least like not important, and then they choose based on tone or familiarity rather than on actual minimization. You have to identify what dimension is being minimized, such as likelihood, impact, or usefulness, and then compare choices on that dimension. Sometimes the least answer is still true, just less significant than the others. Other times it is an option that is technically possible but rare, making it least likely. The keyword tells you the direction of comparison, so your job is to rank options, not to find a single obviously wrong statement.
Context words act as perspective clues, and they interact strongly with these keywords.
Words like policy, oversight, governance, and risk suggest an enterprise viewpoint, while words like configure, patch, and troubleshoot suggest a technical execution viewpoint. If the question implies a governance perspective and asks for the best action, the answer often involves policy, standards, or program-level controls rather than a specific technical tweak.
If the context implies a technical role and asks for the first step, the answer may focus on validation, containment, or establishing a known state before making changes.
Perspective is the hidden axis that makes best and most effective land differently. Reading perspective cues early prevents you from selecting answers that are correct in the wrong layer. Constraints like budget, time, safety, and mission criticality are where best becomes situational rather than universal. If budget is constrained, the best solution may be the one that provides meaningful risk reduction with available resources rather than an ideal control that cannot be implemented. If time is constrained, the first step may emphasize containment and stabilization before deeper remediation. If safety or availability is emphasized, choices that risk disruption may be less appropriate even if they would improve confidentiality. Constraints convert general security wisdom into case-specific judgment, which is exactly what the exam is testing. When you explicitly name the constraint, the correct answer often becomes obvious. Sequencing keywords require understanding dependencies because many security actions only make sense after prerequisites are satisfied. Containment before eradication is a classic dependency, but the broader principle is that you must preserve evidence, confirm scope, and ensure authority before taking irreversible actions.
Similarly, authorization decisions depend on reliable identity, and monitoring depends on logging and baselines.
When first or initial appears, you should mentally ask what must already be true for each option to work. Options that assume prerequisites that are not present are usually later steps.
This dependency mindset turns sequencing questions into logic rather than recall. Likelihood keywords require you to distinguish common causes from edge cases, and that depends on recognizing typical patterns.
Many security questions embed subtle cues about normal operations, user behavior, and common misconfigurations.
When you see most likely, prefer explanations that match frequent failure modes rather than exotic attacks, unless the question explicitly signals an unusual condition.
This does not mean the exam ignores advanced threats, but it does mean it expects you to weigh probability honestly. In real environments, the most common cause is often a misconfiguration, an access control gap, or a process failure, rather than a sophisticated zero-day.
Most likely is an invitation to reason like a practitioner who has seen patterns repeat.
These keywords act like filters, and your score improves when you treat them as the governing rule for selection rather than as incidental language.
Best and most effective shape how you weigh trade-offs. First and initial force correct order, and most likely forces probability-based reasoning. Primary makes you identify intent, while accept and least reverse or minimize the selection logic in ways that demand extra discipline.
Perspective cues and constraints supply the context that tells you how those filters should be applied.
When you consistently apply these filters, you stop being pulled around by plausible-sounding distractors. The result is not just better recall, but better judgment under exam conditions, because you are answering the question that was asked, not the one you wish had been asked.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.